Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of 30 Minutes with a Modern Mystic. I'm Sascha, this is Michael, our Modern Mystic, and today we talk about nature. It's looking so green. What is nature, Michael? I mean, this is the most obvious question to begin with. What is nature to you?
Well, it could be defined as the energy or the power that defines and regulates all life on Earth.
Are we part of that energy?
We are part of that energy, yes. I mean, when Mother Nature gets a bit annoyed with us, like the Hurricane Katrina, was it, that visited New Orleans a few years ago, we sort of realized the power of nature. And nature has an incredible power. And so, I mean, in a way, are God and nature separate? And if God is the energy that is supposed to define and give us an idea of the power of creation from a human viewpoint, then if you just change the word to nature, the power that defines and regulates all life on Earth, it would be, for me, pretty accurate.
And so if we as humanity are part of nature, we define and regulate life on Earth as well.
Actually, nature is the natural evolution of consciousness, and we are the creative evolution of consciousness. But then if we're not conscious, we're not creative, we're simply in more of the same mode. And we have ceased to really be truly creative as conscious beings in the moment. And that doesn't mean that nobody is conscious and nobody is creative. But for instance, creating an original sculpture is very nice because that person has to be in the moment to bring that creation into being. And many people are doing such things with books and literature and art and all sorts of things. But nevertheless, whereas nature is always on duty and is regulating and creating life on Earth, we are, we've lost the plot. We really don't know what we're doing. And so we both depend on God and then blame God if it doesn't go right. Some people, if there's a war, blame God and ask, how could God allow this, all this killing of people and the murder of children? Well, that just simply shows the complete ignorance and the depth of the illusion of humanity, because we'd sort of like to blame. So nature, to me, I will stick with it, is the power that regulates and defines or regulates. I don't like the word controls. Regulates and empowers all life on Earth. It allows nature to find its path of more of who it is and less of what it is not. It allows us that same privilege, but we have lost that path, whereas nature stays on that path because it's conscious, and so it follows a conscious path.
And so would you agree that everything is part of nature, or is there anything outside of that energy of nature?
Everything is an aspect of nature. When you say part of, then that would be very much in our language of separation, which I realize you understand. But part of says we're part of, and that's obviously very meaningful to us and human. But an aspect of means that we're not part of, we are the whole of. Because if we're part of nature, we're the whole of nature. In other words, what I was saying, what I mean by that, because yesterday, Henry and I videoed my garden, a part of it, over 2 hours, and we only did one half of it. And I talked in there about planting your heart, putting your heart into the garden. And the woman asked an interesting question. She said, if your heart is embedded in the earth and you move away, what happens? And I smiled because I thought, yes, that's an interesting one. But what they don't realize is, and of course I didn't say, is when you plant your heart in the garden, although for you, the garden is defined by borders and boundaries of what is yours or where you're renting and living. In fact, when you plant your heart in the garden, you plant it in the earth. And your garden is the whole planet. There is no definition of this is my garden and that is my garden. The earth becomes your garden. And so when you've planted your heart in the garden, no matter where you go, the earth recognizes you. And I mean that. It recognizes you and it knows your state of consciousness.
Right. This is so much more profound, I think, than what most people think of when they begin thinking, when they start thinking about nature. What's your journey with nature? I know you wrote a book, 1988, if I'm correct. It was a bestseller, Talking with Nature, I think it was called. And so maybe you give us a brief overview of how your journey with nature started and what made it so different maybe to other people's journey, and what made you write a book about it at some point.
I guess at the very beginning, I was very influenced by Findhorn, the spiritual community in Scotland. I eventually came to know Peter and Eileen Clady quite well, but in the early days, I didn't know them. But I was fascinated by not so much that they could grow huge cabbages, but I was fascinated because very clearly they had an incredible connection with nature that is no longer common on this planet. I think it was common once. I think the indigenous people that were here originally had this connection with nature in every country. For instance, the Maoris of New Zealand were not the first ones there. And it's said that they committed genocide on the ones up there. So they were an aggressive race, but nevertheless, they made their own connection with nature. It always seems to be that gentle, sweet connection with nature has been wiped out by an aggressive race that comes along. And there is a reason for that, but I won't go into that now. So my journey began when I read about Rock Crombie, who was a scientist who had a relationship with this being called Pan. As far as I was concerned, he was as mad as a hatter, but nevertheless, I really loved what he had to say and thrilled to the possibility, just the possibility that he could have such a relationship. And then there was Dorothy McLean with her relationship with the Deva world and the world of nature through the David kingdom, as she called it. And then even Eileen Caddy with her world of communicating with God. God spoke to me. And I had a bit of skepticism mixed in with all this, but a lot of openness toward it. A lot of please convince me, which I've met people who wanted me to convince them. And then there was Peter Caddy, who was the power behind it all to bring into the physical manifestation of all these strange things that people were talking about. And so one day, I had been listening to Dorothy McLean. Those days we had cassettes, remember them?
Sure.
That's a long way back. And I'd been listening to her cassette about talking with the Deva of the peas. And it was pretty interesting. And so I went out into my veggie garden and there was some peas growing there. And I sat there and tried talking to them. And I listened and talked and listened and talked. And after about an hour, I felt a complete idiot because no peas were talking to me. And what do you say if somebody comes walking up to you? What are you doing? Oh, well, I'm talking to the peas. I mean, so I gave up and I decided that nature was never going to talk to me. And this all came, of course, in the years when I was closing down being a farmer and looking toward moving, traveling around Australia and attempting to be a more spiritual person. And I knew my path.
Maybe if you allow, just a quick question. So up to that point as a farmer, growing up as a farmer and in those, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 years before, would you say that you did not have a conscious connection with nature?
No, I wouldn't say I didn't, but I had if I was conscious of nature, I was unaware of being conscious.
Okay.
But yes, I had a connection with nature, which was very precious to me. I mean, that began because I didn't like people. And I got a lot of trouble at home, and I got in a lot of trouble at school. And always I would turn to nature for comfort and solace. And nature, it felt to me, cared for me. I could sort of creep into the woods, the bar and pool woods, and I'd feel nurtured. I could creep under a few weeping ornamental trees in our garden that was so dense, it was like creeping into a tent. And although people may have been able to see me, I couldn't see them. And if I couldn't see them, they weren't there. And so I felt very nurtured by nature. And so more than probably conscious of, I was very aware of being nurtured by nature because I didn't like people. Of course, you know, this could be a long, long story that might have its place for telling. But eventually, as a farmer, I almost had to, as a young farmer on my father's farm, I almost had to violate nature. And I have to say, I felt very uncomfortable. For instance, about cutting all the hedges down on my father's farm. And I always regretted doing that, but that's what he wanted me to do. But it became a place that also gave me growth. And anyway, and so there was a time when we were traveling around Australia, and I wanted to start a spiritual community like Findhorn in Australia. And we'll skip over all that. But there was a time when I visited an orchard. And then I learned that my book, what was it called? Organic gardening in Australia.
Conscious gardening?
Sorry?
Are you talking of conscious gardening?
No. This is the first one, Organic Gardening in Australia. First organic gardening book ever written in Australia for Australia. Became an instant bestseller. It sort of lured me into thinking writing was easy. It took me only 2 weeks to write it. Anyway, I got a notification to say that it had been published and it was going fast. And would I come back? And so I decided, yes, we'd go back to Tasmania because I was, I think, in Western Australia then. And I decided I'd pick we were staying on a citrus farm, and I decided to pick some oranges and take with me back to a friend in Melbourne, give them to him before I flew away. And so I'm looking around and there's loads of oranges, they were loaded. And then I heard a voice call out. I was picking some oranges off a big tree, and I heard a voice call out in my head. Didn't realize it was in my head at first, very clearly, come over here. And I looked round and there was a small orange tree. I've never seen an orange tree so loaded as this one, but it's much smaller than the others. And so I went over to it and I reached out, and as I touched an orange to pick it, the tree, there was a flow of communication moved into me. And this tree was telling me things I didn't know. And that sort of set me back a bit. I'm thinking, whoa, you know, this is amazing. Wow, okay, I can do this, Dorothy McLean, I can do this. And I asked some questions and they were fluently answered. And I was absolutely stunned. And I picked my oranges and danced out the citrus orchard. And then as I was dancing along, literally leaping up and down and like a big kid. Well, hey, I was only in my early 30s. And suddenly the doubt came in. Am I kidding? Did I really hear that? Well, I knew I had, but the cynical and the skeptical part of me was so strong.
You're questioning your experience?
The rational and the logical part of me, the part that farmed and had to follow programs of farming, that so deeply questioned my experience that I couldn't dismiss it because it was too deeply embedded. So that was the very beginning, without following, that was the beginning of the first time that I really felt nature had communicated with me. It was the beginning of what I made quite a long and difficult journey. And I think probably why talking with nature was very popular, I shared my doubt, I shared my fear, I shared my confusion, because it was all true. And I even had publishers turned it down because I didn't write as an authority. And I couldn't, because I wasn't an authority. I was sharing my experience. Today, yeah, maybe I'm an authority, but then, like 1988 or actually it was 78, the experience happened. It was a while before the book came out.
Really?
But the experience of the book was considerably earlier.
Okay.
And so, yes, I was just sharing my confusion, but so I was completely honestly me. And I think that in fact touched people deeply, that I would be so humble.
And what would you say is it where most of us go wrong in our relationship with nature?
Most of us
go wrong? Like,
I think where we go wrong is we become, the program of the intellectual self gets too strong. We are, like it did with me for a while, nature doesn't talk to you, it can't talk to you. But then Dorothy said it did, and Rock Crombie said it did, and people I respected said it did. And so I began to allow that it was, the possibility was there. And I've been interested to learn in turn that book, Talking with Nature, was the point of inspiration for many people today who are famous for communicating with nature and talking with nature. Many of them now teach it. One of their earliest inspirations, they have told me, was talking with nature, because it allowed them to say, oh, wow, this is real after all. And I was touched by that I, who needed permission, was able to give permission to others.
Is you're talking with nature, your communication with nature, something that is ongoing, or is it something that you switch on and off, or is it something that can also hit you by surprise?
At that time, it came up and hit me by surprise. Now, it very rarely hits me by surprise. I can switch it off by not listening, and I can switch it on by listening. But I've also developed it and moved to the point I can communicate with forests, trees and forests, trees as individuals and forests as a whole. I can communicate with a grain of sand or a mountain. And I found that I can communicate with the planet Earth, and I can even communicate with the universe.
Does nature...
I don't expect really everybody to believe that.
Does nature want to communicate with us, or is it more of a neutral kind of position it takes, and oh, there's somebody to communicate, comes along, that's fine, but...
Nature has no want, that's very human. But let's put it this way, everything is energy. All energy is information, and all information is continually sharing itself.
Okay.
Now, it is subtle and it is silent, but there is a point where if you have the humility, you can develop the humility, and you have, let's say, if you're strongly left brain, this is always going to be difficult. If you're whole brain or right brain, it's probably best if you're very young and you're open, really, really open. Then you can tune in to that flow of communication that is never ends. It's always there. I think somebody once wrote a little quote that I loved, Kathleen Raine, I think her name was, R-A-I-N-E. I think Kathleen Raine, and she wrote, "It is not so much that nature learns to speak. It is that humans learn to listen. And boy, that is profoundly true. It took me 5 years to learn to listen. So although before then I did have communication with nature moving, it was only after then that I began to fine tune it and really deepen it to a level that I trusted totally.
I would even go as far as to say that not being able to listen might be the reason number one that we are doing to the planet what we're doing to it. The reason why we're able to be so destructive to us as a race and to the planet is because we're never listening to anybody or anything.
We don't listen to anybody, and we don't listen to our own soul screaming.
Right.
Because many souls are screaming.
Now we only have 5 more minutes. What can someone do to deepen the relationship with nature, or to change it, or to have a look at it?
I think first there has to be the desire, and then you have to let go of the desire. So there is no want, no desire. And then you have to be open to realize this is possible. And then you have to ask yourself, why am I doing this? Is there something I want to learn? Is there something I want to gain? And you have to realize that the intellect can't really do this. The left brain is not its province. It doesn't do this. And so I have read many people's communication with nature, and some of them, I know they're false. But I also know that you've got to go through translating it in you with an attachment to your own personal way of seeing life before you can eventually grow beyond your attachment to your personal view of life and allow it to flow through you in a non-attached, non-personal way. And that takes a lot of doing. And in talking with nature, I never really achieved that.
Right. So what can you do?
Now, me?
No. I mean, going back to that question, what can someone do? A first step, maybe.
Okay, a first step is just like playing a piano. You have to practice. And the most deepest asset you need is to trust yourself. That is the first requirement. When I communicated once with a fig tree and I was so full of doubt, and the fig tree, the rubber tree plant, which is a fig, but the rubber tree plant said, so if 20,000 people were listening to this right now, and they all heard what I am saying, would you no longer doubt yourself? Is that what you need? And I realized, yes, that's exactly what I need. And I realized it wasn't going to happen. That either I trusted myself or I just walk away from it and give up. And that wasn't an option. And so I had to learn to trust myself. And for me, the path to trusting myself was a long, slow, and painful path.
I was just going to say, I think for most people, trusting yourself is a really hard one.
It's very difficult, very hard. And yet, it's as easy as we allow it. As always, the great truths are. Trust is an incredible power.
You have an upcoming online course about hidden insights of nature. You want to speak about that for a moment?
Hidden insights in the spirit world of nature. Yes, I mean, I know that I was asked for a program, which I couldn't give, because to me, nature is always in the moment. There's no program of what I want to take from nature to teach people. It doesn't work that way for me. Maybe some people it does, but it doesn't work that way for me. And so when I go into nature in the moment, it's like going into the garden. If I go into the garden, then the fact is I'm connecting with the spirit of the earth, the spirit of nature, and the spirit of the garden. Now you could say they're all one, and they are, but there are different levels of hierarchy, if you like, in the spirit of the garden, the spirit of nature, and the spirit of the earth. in some ways there is a hierarchical difference, and so it gets more profound. Now, if I go into the garden and I'm completely lost in what I'm doing, then nothing happens. But if I'm conscious of doing and I'm being in the garden, so I'm conscious of being with while doing too, then I feel that conscious connection with the spirit of the garden. And I come out knowing more than when I went in there. Now, it won't always pertain to gardening, it pertains to life. And I have greater insights, intuitions pop up, because I'm in the moment with life. And you can't be in the moment with life without becoming infected by life, without becoming absorbed by life as you absorb life. It's all mutual. There's nothing outside self. And that is one of the keys to what I will be talking about. There's nothing outside self. Intellectually, that doesn't make sense. Metaphysically, it makes huge sense. And to the hidden insights of nature, it's a metaphysical journey.
Thank you very much. Thank you also, all you listeners. Make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to Michael's channel here and on all these other platforms. You can find a list of these Michael's channels below.
In many ways, the more people that join, the energetic connection gets greater, and often that allows to go deeper because
right.
There's more energy connected in that moment, conscious energy.
Right. Okay, perfect. And make sure to share the video, and see you in the next episode. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you, Sascha.